What is the saddest story somebody's told you while sitting at a bar? Story 1. I had a guy come in once and sit at the bar, and he just stares at the bar top. After a few beers, he finally looked up and we started chatting. He was just walking through downtown Portland, and a man had jumped off the 30th story of a building and landed at his feet. He still had blood on him. I gave him a free beer because what the duck? Story 2. Last month, during a rainy graduation day, a family, mostly adults, came to celebrate a few hours before graduation ceremony. While waiting, the daughter of the family kept calling her boyfriend, who did not answer. After placing their food order, the daughter got a call back. While driving toward the Civic Center, the boyfriend hydroplaned into a telephone pole. He died on the way to the hospital. I didn't know these people, but even my heart dropped hearing this sudden news. Everyone was in shock. They canceled their food order, and the daughter and her mother left to go to the hospital. The dad and a few other family members stayed to have a few more drinks, which my manager later comped. I didn't know what to say other than to nod as they walked out. Story 3. A guy used to come into the Jamaican restaurant bar I was working at, so I asked him how things are, and he tells me that the third of his 4 kids have died. Some type of cancer. The gene responsible for the susceptibility to this cancer is only passed from the father's side, so his wife's leaving him. Story 4. I've bartended in the same town for many, many years, and see the same people at every bar I work at. My very favorite regular is a Vietnam veteran with severe PTSD, early onset dementia, and a serious drinking problem. Very few people are kind to him, and he's been 86'd from nearly every bar in town, including the ones I work at now, but I've been known to let him sit down and talk to me for a few minutes every now and then, especially if it's cold outside, because he looks to the casual observer like a worthless drunk. However, having heard just a fraction of his story, and knowing the crap that he's been through, I find it hard not to show him kindness and respect. Well, a few years back, he was on his first and only drink of the night at my bar. He was pretty blitzed, and I could not rightfully serve more than that since I knew he was walking home. Anyways, a young man stumbled in and sat down and showed me his military ID, ordered a drink, sat at the opposite end of the bar from the older regular customer. He told me he had just finished his second tour in Iraq. His best friend had died from injuries sustained in a roadside bombing, and he was pretty torn up about it. Got home and realized his girlfriend had been ducking another one of his best friends while he was overseas. He joined the military right out of high school, mostly due to peer pressure by his father. It hit me all at once that the 2 men at my bar were exactly alike, except maybe 20 to 30 years in age. Before I could process how parallel their lives were and how this young man may very well end up exactly like the older man, my regular got up from his bar, walked over to the young man at the opposite side. He shook the young man's hand, leaned in and said, "Trust me, brother. I know. You're a hell of a guy." It was such a poignant moment. To anyone else, it may have looked like a random drunken, "I love you, man" type moment, but it was so much more, and simply stated that it brought me to tears. Story 5. During the Super Bowl a few years back, a woman sat alone on one of my lounge tables. I stepped from behind the bar to take her order, and she was simply staring at the television crying. After I brought her single order of egg rolls, chain restaurant appetizer, she looked at me with desperate sadness. I finally asked her if she was okay, and completely uncomfortable and concerned when she said, "My husband of 15 years is at this game. He said with coworkers, but someone called me weeks ago saying he was really going with his girlfriend. I never expected he was cheating. I hired a detective and it's true. He's cheating. My lawyer had him served with divorce papers just before he left for the game. He hasn't called me." Then she went back to watching the game crying. I imagine she was waiting to spot him in some of the off-chance miracle. I tried to buy her drinks and meal, but she refused, saying her dinner was on her husband. She left while I was in the kitchen and left an absolute monster tip. Story 6. There was a shy old man who comes into a bar a couple times a week. He would sit at the end of the bar and drink screwdrivers, never speaking to us except to order his drink or more drinks. It was slow one day, so I pulled up a book out of my purse to do a little reading. He perked up immediately. He began to talk to me about all the books he's read and I've read, etc., and the next time he came in, he brought his copy of The 5 People You Meet in Heaven and asked if I'd like to borrow it. Since then, every time he's came in, he'd bring a new book and tell me about his life. Nothing extraordinary, just grown kids who never see anymore and his old job working in a factory. Well, he stopped coming in, and I seemed to be the only one concerned with it. Later, I found out he died. Oh, that old drunk? He was at another bar, drank himself into one of those stupors, and fell off the bar stool. He cracked his head open. Nobody understood why that bothered me so much. Story 7. I used to work at a dive bar for 2+ years, and had the same customers every day. I enjoyed the company of the old men, but when you really think about it, it was really sad how they all were spreading their lives. Most of them would be shaking when they would hand me cash for their first drink, and I had to set my morals aside for every shift. I had this one regular who would come in before we would even open, and I served him over a year before I realized how sad his life was. He was always so happy but secretly depressed. One night, after everyone left, he's pretty much spilt the beans on his life. At one point, he had worked his whole life being a pilot, and finally got engaged and was living in the South extremely happy. Then the economy tanked, he lost his job, and fiancé in return broke off the engagement. He was forced to move back to Iowa and work for his a-hole brother, a construction company, doing manual labor at age 50. After he moved back, he had to live with his mother because she became ill. This all happened within a matter of months, and now he spends 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. every day crap-faced at the same bar and walks home to his mom's house and walks back to his truck in the morning for work. It makes me sad every time I think about him. Story 8. I worked at a pretty rough bar when I was young, the sort frequented by bikies and other social outcasts where there's more tattoos on display than clean skin. One of the regulars was a guy of about 50. He had brain damage. He had done time in the prison cell, and the inmates had put him into a commercial spin dryer, which damaged him irreparably. He could not articulate words very well and pretty much kept to himself, but was always courteous and friendly when spoken to. One day, the police arrived and took him away. Turned out he killed his mother, with whom he lived, with a kitchen knife about a week earlier, and had continued going about his daily routine as normal, because he did not grasp the significance of what he's done. It affected me for a long time because of the overwhelming sadness of it all. Story 9. I'm gay. When I was in high school, I fell in love with my best friend. This was very normal. I mean, every gay kid fell in love with his best friend in an era where kids could not be out of the closet if they wanted to live. Anyways, I loved him, desperately, would do anything for him, and I could never tell him. We went to a movie once. We arrived an hour and a half earlier after having dinner someplace, parked near the theater, and it was pouring rain. And the theater had no seats in the lobby. So we folded down the seats in the back of the SUV, climbed back there, and spent over an hour just laying next to each other and talking. I was absolutely painful not to just reach out and touch him, kiss him. I felt so close and connected to him, but I could not. We went in, saw the movie. It was Ghost, and it features the song rather prominently. That night was the closest thing I've ever had to a date before I was 18. A year later, I came out of the closet, and he stopped talking to me. I decided to give him some time to get over it and then try to talk to him. Our mutual friends were all thinking or having the opinion that maybe he wasn't straight and was having a hard time dealing with my having come out when he wasn't ready to deal with whatever feelings he might have. I did not know, but I could wait and see. Well, he got brain cancer and died. I didn't find out until afterward, and we never spoke again. I understand he never dated anybody. I never got to tell him how desperately I loved him or that he was the most beautiful man who's ever lived. I can't listen to that song from Ghost anymore. I go completely to pieces every single time. Story 10. Just the other night, I had a guy who was on vacation solo because his wife filed for divorce right before they were supposed to leave. Yesterday, he got a call. His father died. Our planned entertainment for the evening happened to be a 20-something-year-old guy who played nothing but acoustic love songs for the first part of his set. Poor guy just starts sobbing in his seat. Thankfully, the musician altered his set list. A couple of guys, also solo at the bar, bought the guy a drink and hung out with him. And at one point, they even had him laughing. Really restored my faith in humanity. Story 11. A guy came in obviously intoxicated. Proceeded to tell me his wife was leaving him for his business partner, and that partner was forcing him out of their business altogether. He was losing his kids, business, pretty much everything he ever cared about. Then he asked me to call the police because he was afraid to be alone because he might harm himself. About 10 minutes later, the police showed up, took the man outside and asked him a few questions, then came back in and asked me what his deal was. I said he wasn't bothering anybody, and that it seemed like he was having a rough go for it. The couple at the bar felt so bad they paid for his tab. When the cops showed up, they just went right outside. I've never looked up the definition of dejected, but this guy would have had his picture next to it, I'm sure. Story 12. Some guy once came into the bar where I worked looking pretty upset. He asked if he could use the bathroom before buying any drinks. I let him, and he came back looking a lot more composed. Sat down, ordered a drink, drank it quietly, then had another in the same fashion. After a couple of hours, he asked if he could call him a cab as his cell phone wasn't working. I did, but was told it would be an hour as the cab company is busy. I offered him a coffee to sober him up a bit. He got to chatting after that and told me that he'd managed to trace his birth mother and had been to meet her earlier that day. Turns out that she had given him up as he was the result of her dad sexually abusing her. She thought about keeping him but discovered her brother interfering with him while she had left him to babysit, which was what prompted her to give him up. When he'd see his mom, she was a mess and actually looked more haggard than his adopted grandmother due to a life on drugs and alcohol. Utterly awful stuff. Story 13. Overheard a guy who came in with a large group talking to the guy next to him. Apparently, the group was an adult school for the blind. The guy was not quite blind yet, but was quickly losing his eyesight. He's going to be completely blind. He was telling a story of how his 6-year-old son had asked him when his eyes would get better, and having to explain to him that they never would. Then he went on to talk about how he would never see his son grow up, graduate, get married, nothing. It was so intensely personal and sad I felt guilty overhearing it. Not the worst story I've heard behind the bar, but for some reason it stuck with me the longest. Story 14. I have a very sweet regular who used to order food to go and have a glass of wine and a cigar in his car while waiting for it. One night, he unexpectedly comes in, sits down at the bar to get dinner. It's a bit of a slow night, so we get to chatting. I asked him how he's doing, and he looks me in the eye with this peculiar smile and says this. You know my wife, that gorgeous blonde I used to come in with? Well, she died of cancer last week. He goes on to tell me how perfect their life was up until the diagnosis, and how our go-to food was sometimes the only thing that sounded good during her chemo. This all happened on the 15th anniversary of my father's death from melanoma. We both got teary-eyed. I bought his meal. After he left, I had to spend a few minutes in the back trying to get my crap together. Couple weeks ago, he brought in his first date since his wife passed. Glad to say they had a wonderful time. It was nice to see him laugh. Story number 15. Final story. A few years ago, we were giving free meals to any veterans or active duty military personnel that came in on Veterans Day. We just opened up but already had a decent crowd in the restaurant, and I had several people sitting at the bar. One of the older gentlemen was wearing a Korean War veteran hat and had came in by himself. He sat there a couple minutes before finally saying, "You know, I think I'll have a Manhattan." After making the drink and putting in his order for the free meal, I chatted with him for a moment. It was the normal, "What branch do you serve in? For how long? Thank you for your service" kind of chit-chat. He talked briefly about his experience and then, through slightly blurred eyes, mentioned that, quote, "Yeah, I lost my boy in Iraq the first time we were there. Not really knowing how to respond, all I could say was, 'I'm really sorry to hear that.' When his food arrived, I asked if there was anything else he needed. 'Everything tastes so good, how about another one of those Manhattans?' Now, keep in mind, this is a chain restaurant. We're not a real bar, so free drinks aren't something we're supposed to ever give out. It was the first time and only time I've ever broken the rule. I was happy to do it as I gave the appreciative, friendly old man his second drink. It had gotten pretty busy by that point, so I didn't have much of a chance to further any kind of discussion with him. He quietly finished his meal, paid for his drink, stood up from the bar stool, and lingered on for a moment. I looked at him and thanked him again for his service and for coming in. He responded, 'Well, thank you. The food was great. The Manhattan tasted really good.' That was the first drink I've had in 17 years.